So a few weeks back, I posted our 2022-23 warm up and tweeted that I would follow it up with a PDF or a video explanation. So as promised, here it is. Firstly, before we get rolling with it, I ask that you don't get too focused on the specific exercises here themselves. They're important, but they're replaceable. These are the exercises that I select for the athletes that I work with to help them warm up for the training sessions that I design. You have a different group of athletes warming up for different sessions with likely very different objectives. So while you may want to copy some of the exercises you may feel are useful, please don't just blindly copy the whole thing. I hope instead that you focus on the principles behind their selection, and perhaps you can use some of the justifications for what we do as a springboard for your own ideation. Okay, let's get rolling. As always, if you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to reach out to me on social or email. Thanks in advance for watching. I really hope that you find this useful. Okay, so I'm just going to let this roll and just sort of talk over it. Like most, we follow a pretty typical sort of general to specific organization of our exercises in our warm-up. Most of the athletes get to training about 15 to 20 minutes early and do some self-calibration, as you see here, just some extra stretching or mobility work before the main session begins. This might include rolling on balls, band distraction work, some long duration isometrics, or some table time even with the therapists. We then start with 2 laps generally, alternating walking with some easy strides or an easy jog if they prefer. Some of the athletes prefer to jog rather than to walk to stride, especially the quarter milers. And then we get rolling with the general mobility portion of the warm up, which is all on their feet. So far, everything has been on their feet. And by the way, I know a lot of coaches might start the warm up, with on ground stuff, right? But we tend to begin on the feet, as I said, and then the athletes can use the information that they gain from, being on their feet, doing kind of sprinting like things to help determine what the types of things they do on the ground a little bit later on in the warm up. There's quite a lot of flexibility, that said, in everything that we do here. The athletes are encouraged to spend as much or as little time on each element as they like. So if the athlete feels like the hip flexors are tighter during the early warm-up strides than normal, for example, then once they move to the on-the-ground stuff, they can spend a little time trying to work on this, or maybe they spend some time with the therapist. You'll see as you're watching here that we try to work through all 3 planes, frontal, sagittal, and transverse planes, through 3 ranges of motion, small, medium, and large, and through 3 velocities, slow, moderate, and fast. Again, what we do specifically isn't that important. Only that, from the sense that we work through this, 3x3 matrix. And then you can just be creative with it within that, right? As I said, we don't really do anything that's super unique. Most folks now know, why we all have to warm up, right? From raising, core temperature to lowering viscous resistance to increasing blood flow, improving oxygen delivery, etc. Whatever the specific motivation, it all simply feeds the primary purpose of increasing the preparedness for what is to come, right? And thus attempting to maximize performance. I don't know who coined it, but I really like the RAMP acronym. It might have been Ian Jeffries as it relates to the warm-up, right? R being raising body temperature, heart rate, blood flow, etc. A standing for activate, M standing for mobilize, and the P standing for potentiate. I think this is a really good way to remember the overall objectives of the component parts of the warm-up when you're designing yours. And I think any good warm-up should really adhere to all of these, objectives in the ramp. But this misses one big thing, one component that a lot of coaches forget, and which I think is the most important part of the warm up, and that's to help stabilize the technical foundations of the most important shapes and patterns involved in the sport, task, or activity. I hear this complaint from team sport coaches a lot, right? I visit with a lot of team sports and talk to their coaches, and a lot of them say they just don't have enough time to work with athletes to have any significant impact on their running technique. But it's just not true, because every day the athlete needs to warm up. So every day you have an opportunity to work on improving how they move. And then it's just up to us to use that time to ensure that we're working on not only the thing that the sport requires, or even that the upcoming session requires, but also the technical things that the athlete requires to get better. So many coaches are just reading off a list of exercises, not really warming athletes up, not really paying any attention to how these exercises are executed. And this lack of intention from the coach is translated into the same lack of intention in the athletes. And so the warm-up just ends up being this thing that happens before training, this thing that they have to do before the real stuff actually begins. And that's just not the right way to look at it, is it? So the take-home point here for you is to make sure that you are coaching the warm-up. Don't just read off a list of stuff and watch. As we've said a ton about at ALTIS, the warm-up is our first movement screen, both for you as the coach, as well as for the athlete. Both coach and athlete should really be paying attention to what the movement looks and feels like. Intention and attention are two things we talk a lot about. Now, a couple of words on the design of this specific warm-up. This particular group of athletes we're watching are sprinters, where the performance they're warming up for is often sprinting at close to maximal intensity in spikes on a track. So the warm-up may look very different than if it did with a group of football players who are preparing to work through a technical tactical session, for example, with far higher densities than what we would typically work at, or what we would typically work at, right? The warm-up you're watching here will typically take about 45 minutes or so, depending upon the weather and the specific focus of the session itself. But regardless of the time you have, the objectives remain the same, and that's to identify the most relevant shapes and patterns in the sport, task, or activity we're warming up for, and work on them in both general and specific ways. So in this case, we work to improve the foot to ground interaction, the attack angle, the scissoring of the thighs, the shape of the pelvis, and the position of the torso relative to the center of mass. These are the things that matter to a sprinter. They matter in the main part of the session, and they matter in the warm-up to the main part of the session. So as you continue to watch this, try to critically observe these 5 primary shapes and patterns. What does the ground interaction look like? What does the attack angle look like? How do the thighs scissor in space and time? Can the athletes hold their pelvis in a stable position as they move? What is the shape of the torso? The medicine ball exercises are chosen specifically for these purposes. We're working here to improve the scissoring of the thighs, the rotation of the spine, the interaction of the foot with the ground, and the dynamic control of the pelvis, etc., etc. And when we talk about sprint mechanics, I find that many coaches get a little stuck in the weeds, right? Especially when it comes to talking to the athletes about how we want them to run. Instead, I prefer to zoom out. What are the most
important, most common, most relevant shapes and patterns in sprinting. And then we work to try to improve the stability and adaptability of these all the time. So throughout the warm-up and continuing here with these med ball exercises, you'll see exercises that, as I said, they focus on foot and ground interaction, the attack angle of the shin, the scissoring of the thighs in space and time, the position of the pelvis, and the position of the torso relative to the center of mass. I try to find as many ways as I can to work on these shapes and patterns. So rather than doing typical sprint drills that really don't challenge these very well at all, at least not for elite sprinters, I choose other methods like medicine ball work, bounding, skipping, etc. Well, I think that's about it, right? This is the meat and bones of the warm up. This is kind of what we do. It's, as I said, it's nothing too fancy. I hope you found this useful. If you didn't, let me know. If you did, let me know as well. Shoot me a message on any of my socials or just email me at smcmillan@altis.world. Love to hear from you.